My young friend, the legends that have been told for so many years always speak of heroes, just kings, brave knights, loyal friends. But in every story there is another truth lurking in the shadows. A kingdom is not only destroyed by external enemies. Sometimes the greatest danger grows within the walls of the palace itself. Today I will tell you of one of Camelot's darkest days. Morgana. She was of King Arthur's blood, but in her heart she dreamed of another throne. In a land where magic was forbidden, the silent footsteps of a woman seeking power echoed. The wind of her betrayal would rewrite Arthur's fate. But be patient, my young friend. We cannot rush the story. First, we must understand how it all began. Because every betrayal begins with a small spark of suspicion. The night is long, there are many stories to tell by the fireplace. But today I will tell you one of the darkest, my young friend. Because every betrayal has a beginning. And the beginning of this betrayal is hidden in the hidden sins of a king. Long ago, Uther Pendragon, one of the most powerful rulers of Camelot, ruled his kingdom with an iron fist. His sense of justice was harsh but unadulterated. He showed no mercy to his enemies and unquestioning loyalty to his friends. But no matter how mighty he was only human. And the weakest part of human beings is the desires hidden deep in their hearts. One night, exhausted by war, this mighty king could not control his heart. Igraine, the beautiful wife of Gorlois, Duke of Cornwall, a woman whose beauty captured not only the eyes but also the soul. Uther could not resist her. He could neither love nor desire her. But Igraine was loyal to her duke, until Merlin's magic rewove the threads of fate. Merlin, how many fates have not been touched by the old wizard's hand? At Uther's request, an illusion was created on a dark night. Uther magically assumed the form of Gorlois and entered Igraine's bosom. That night was not just a deception. That night was the first shadow to fall on the future of Camelot. For from this union 2 children would be born. One Arthur, the bright hope of the kingdom, the other Morgana, who would grow up in the shadows and feed on anger. But to be wise is not to judge the past, my young friend. The sins of the past are often laid on the shoulders of the innocent. Morgana was like that. She grew up not knowing who her father was. She was raised the daughter of the Duke of Cornwall. When she learned that her father was Uther, her world was shattered. Her mother had never spoken the truth, but no matter how long a lie is hidden, one day it will crack through even the strongest walls. After her father's death, Morgana was brought to Camelot. Uther Pendragon accepted her as one of his own blood. But deep down, the presence of this child reminded him of his own sins. Morgana grew up as a member of the royal family, but she was never fully accepted. She bloomed like a lonely flower within the stone walls of the palace. She was strong, she was smart, but most of all, there was something else sprouting inside her. Magic. Yes, my young friend. Morgana was no ordinary girl. Even as a child, she began to see the future in her dreams. As nightmares haunted her sleep, her visions gradually became reality. At first, she thought they were just coincidences, but then she realized he had not come to this world as an ordinary human being. Magic was in his blood, just like the legacy of the ancient wizards in his mother's lineage. But Uther Pendragon was hard on magic, ruthless. In his eyes, witchcraft was another name for treachery and evil. Morgana had to hide her gift. But you know, my young friend, the more something is suppressed, the more it comes back with a vengeance. And so it began. Morgana grew up in Camelot, a child of her own blood, carrying the power her father hated. Without realizing it, she was taking the first steps on a journey that would one day change her destiny. But be patient. There is a time for everything. The shadow inside Morgana had not yet awakened. But one day, that shadow would grow large enough to shake Camelot. As the wind beat against the stone walls of Camelot, it whispered a secret long forgotten. A sage's voice reaches your ears, echoing from the shadows of the past. Ah, my young friend, there are some encounters that are like knots woven by fate itself. There are moments when two souls touch, and the whole world is changed by that contact. Today, I will tell you about such a moment. The first time Morgana met Merlin. As a noble girl raised in Camelot, Morgana seemed to lead a glorious life on the outside, but deep in her heart, only she knew the storm raging inside. When she closed her eyes at night, she dreamed of burning cities, toppled towers, bloody battlefields, and worst of all, he didn't know if these images were real. It was on one of these nights that he woke up, jumping out of his sleep. He was out of breath, cold sweat beaded on his forehead. There was a fear in his heart that he could not understand. The dream he had that night was different from the others. He saw a man with a long robe and eyes full of wisdom and secrets. The man looked up at him and whispered, "Your destiny is calling you." Morgana did not know what these words meant, but she would soon learn who this mysterious man was. Yes, my young friend, those were the days when Merlin stalked Camelot. He was always by Arthur's side, like his shadow, but he managed to disappear in the crowds. He was known to the people only as a counselor, but there was something that even Uther Pendragon did not realize. Merlin was not just an advisor, he was one of the greatest wizards of the age, and he was quick to realize that Morgana was no ordinary girl. The day he and Morgana met for the first time, the wind was sharp and chilly in the great courtyard of the palace. Morgana was standing alone in a corner. The voices of the people around her did not even reach her. Her mind was filled with the echoes of her dream. At that moment, a pair of wise eyes turned toward him. Merlin. As Merlin studied her, something stirred inside Morgana, a foreign feeling. She felt as if this man could read her mind, a deep, quiet, unsettling feeling. And in that moment, Merlin realized something. Morgana's aura was different. Those invisible currents, invisible to the human eye, swirled around her, writhing at his fingertips. It was magic. Yes, my young friend, a person who is a sorcerer feels the presence of another sorcerer. It is difficult to describe it in words. It is like a musician understanding a timbre touched by another musician, or a swordsman senses the spirit of a warrior in the movements of his opponent. Merlin knew at a glance the power that was burgeoning within Morgana. And in that moment, a feeling was born in his heart, for he had prophecies about the future. And in these prophecies, the fate of Camelot was written in two possibilities. If Morgana chose the right path, she could become a great protector. But if she fell into darkness, if her anger swallowed her, she would become a queen who would destroy Camelot with her own hands. Merlin approached Morgana in silence, his eyes locked with hers. For a moment, the world was silent, and that's when Morgana felt something too. This man she didn't know, whose name she didn't even know, he seemed to be keeping a secret from her. Merlin bowed his head and walked away, saying nothing. But intuition whispered to him, "This girl will determine the future of Camelot. She must be guided." But how? Ah, my young friend, Merlin did not yet know what to do. But he knew one thing. Morgana was no ordinary girl, and the power within her, if not channeled in the right direction, could one day burn all of Camelot to the ground. But be patient. That moment had not yet come. The storm had not yet begun. But very soon, we would all see what this power awakened in Morgana meant. Ah, my young friend, time does not stop, it flows, and history is like a river shaped in this flowing time. Sometimes the waters are still, sometimes they overflow and wash the shores away. And this was such a time for Camelot. When Uther Pendragon died, a hush fell over the stone halls of Camelot. The death of a king is not just the death of a man, my young friend. It is the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. The people mourned, but they also feared for the future. For there was no doubt who would take the throne after Uther. Uther Pendragon would be king. But when the crown is placed on a man's head, it is not just an ornament. It is a burden, a destiny, and a curse. With the death of his father, Uther had to bear this burden. His footsteps echoing through the stone walls of the palace were no longer those of a prince, but of a king. The people were kneeling before him, offering their allegiance. But, my young friend, not everyone rejoiced when he became king. Morgana. Yes, Morgana was silent at the coronation. She paid her respects to Uther like everyone else. But her eyes could not hide the storm raging in his heart. Once she and Uther had grown up as brothers. Once she had sat at the same table and laughed under the same sky. But now those childhood days were far away. Morgana had a growing feeling inside her, an uneasiness. In the early days of Uther's reign, Morgana began to think about his rule. Uther was a good man, yes, but being a good man did not always mean being a good king. He was merciful to his people, he was just, but at the same time, was he too idealistic, too naive? After a harsh ruler like Uther, Uther's throne was ripe for shaking, and Morgana knew it. There was a thought echoing within her, "Don't I have a right to this throne?" Remember, my young friend, Morgana was not just any noblewoman, she was Uther's daughter. But Uther never saw her as his heir. He saw her not as heir to the throne, but only as a woman. And now in her place, Uther was on the throne. Was it possible for her to rule as a woman? Was Camelot ready for that? Or was Uther really the most suitable king? Morgana's mind was slowly turning into a labyrinth. As she walked through it, she was unwittingly embarking on a path, the path of doubt. And my young friend, doubt is sometimes like a seed. It starts small, but when it grows, it becomes a huge tree. The seed inside Morgana had begun to sprout, and one day its roots will shake the stone walls of Camelot. But be patient. It is too early. The storm is just beginning. Ah, my young friend, some talents are a blessing, others are a curse. And there are some who have a fire that has been sleeping inside them since they were born. They live their lives without even realizing it, until one day, fate fanned the flames. Morgana was like that. She was no ordinary woman. From the very beginning, she had a power inside her. But it took a dark night for her to realize it. That night, Morgana was plagued by nightmares again. The dreams she was having were not just dreams. Before his eyes, the events of the future unfolded. Bloody battles, the crumbling walls of Camelot, the fall of Uther. He woke up sweating. His heart was pounding like crazy. But the strangest thing was the whispers echoing in his room. The candles flickered. The wind through the window whispered an unknown word. And then, something happened. Morgana raised her hands in fear, and the candles in the room suddenly went out by themselves. At first, she thought it was a coincidence. But then, night after night, the same thing happened again. When she stretched out her hands, the fire took shape. With her breath, the wind rose. When she closed her eyes, she saw the future. Morgana could now feel the power within herself. But in Camelot, practicing magic meant death. Uther's father, Uther, had waged a brutal war against magic. In his time, wizards were burned, druids banished, magic outlawed. Morgana was doomed to live as a witch in this order of her own blood. So she began to develop her power in secret. Every night, when everyone was asleep, in the dark corners of her room, she opened her hands and tried to feel the flow of magic. She learned to summon fire, to manipulate the wind, to whisper in the water. But most of all, he realized that his dreams were real. Meanwhile, the Druids who lived outside the borders of Camelot were talking about her. They sensed Morgana's abilities, for followers of the old religion recognized their own blood, and one day they met her. When Morgana sneaked out of the palace, she came across a camp of Druids in the deep forests of Camelot. They were people who knew the old ways of magic, who lived in harmony with nature. They told her that her power was not a curse, but a legacy left to her by her ancestors. But what the Druids could teach him was limited. To receive true knowledge, he needed someone more powerful. That's when he met Nimue. Ah, Nimue, the ancient sorcerer of ancient times. She was once the lady of the Great Lake, a being who ruled the water, the purest form of magic. But in Uther's war against the wizards, she too was banished from Camelot. Now he was waiting for someone like Morgana to restore his power. When they first met, Nimue's eyes were as dark as a deep lake. He recognized the power in Morgana at a glance. "If you follow me, you will find out who you are," he told her. Morgana hesitated, but only for a brief moment. Then she took her first step. And so, my young friend, Morgana's path took an irreversible turn. She was no longer just a noble woman of Camelot. She was a being summoned by magic. But remember, magic is a double-edged sword. Morgana was about to discover her true power, but at the same time, she didn't yet know what it would cost her. Trust, my friend, is more precious than gold. But once it's broken, to restore it, now that's something even the greatest wizard can't do. Morgana had sensed from the beginning that Merlin was different. When she first came to the palace, she had noticed the silence, the watchful gaze in his eyes. Merlin followed Arthur like a shadow, protecting him from every danger. But most importantly, Merlin really cared about Arthur, and this planted the first seeds of doubt in Morgana. Because in Camelot, people only acted on orders. No one would put their life on the line to truly protect someone. But Merlin was doing it. Why was he doing it? Morgana began to ask. She watched Merlin as he walked the stone corridors of the palace, searching for clues to the magic. At night she followed him secretly to see how Merlin protected Arthur, and each time he discovered something. Some things were the joke went a little too far. Some things were too coincidental. One night, the poison in Arthur's drink suddenly spilled. During a battle, the arrow that came at him changed direction just in time, and most importantly, that night when the candles in Morgana's room flickered, that dark glow in Merlin's eyes as he looked at her, Morgana felt that Merlin was a wizard. But what frightened her was that no one knew it. Merlin was protecting Arthur, sacrificing everything for the future of Camelot. And for Morgana, this was a great threat, because if Arthur remained strong, it would delay Morgana's rise to the power she deserved. That day, a silent war against Merlin began inside Morgana. She did nothing to him, yet, but she watched him. She waited in silence to learn his secrets. Because the best way to defeat an enemy was to understand him first. And Morgana knew how to wait. Love, what a power, isn't it? But remember, my young friend, love doesn't only elevate someone, it can also destroy it. And sometimes, love is the cause of the greatest betrayal. Morgana loved Guinevere. Once upon a time, when Guinevere fell in love with Arthur, Morgana watched her. She listened to his innocent looks, his words of pure love. But over time, something changed inside Morgana. Because Guinevere's love for Arthur was becoming a threat, a loyal, loving queen by Arthur's side would make it harder for Morgana to reach the throne. So he began to plant seeds of doubt in Guinevere's heart. She told her that Arthur was weak as a king. She whispered that his marriage to a commoner would upset the order of Camelot. And most importantly, she told him about Lancelot. Lancelot was Arthur's most loyal knight, but at the same time his affection for Guinevere was evident in his eyes. Morgana saw that, and she used it. One day she spoke to Lancelot. She questioned his loyalty, whether he fought for Arthur or lived for Guinevere, and she saw a moment of hesitation in Lancelot's eyes. In that moment, Morgana understood everything. Lancelot would protect Guinevere before Arthur. Knowing this, he could win her to his side. And so Morgana quietly began to play her game. But remember, my young friend, he who plays with love will eventually burn himself in the flame. And Morgana would realize this much, much later. Fate, my friend, is a strange thing. Sometimes it leads us down a path we never expected, and sometimes it brings us face to face with the very thing we fear the most. But remember, destiny is shaped only in the hands of the strong, and Morgana was determined to write her own destiny. Morgana felt something was different the first time she saw him. Mordred, he was just a little boy then, innocent, timid, and dangerously strong. Their first encounter took place not in the stone corridors of Camelot, but deep in the forest, in the mists. Morgana had heard rumors that a group of druids had been kidnapped and had secretly gone in search of them. And there, in the midst of fallen trees and burnt bushes, she saw him. She was sandwiched between a group of Camelot soldiers, watching a knight she held aloft with her tiny hands. The soldier was being strangled by an invisible force. Mordred's eyes, those tiny eyes, held a great storm. At that moment, something inside Morgana trembled. This boy, this was no ordinary boy. This child was magic. But most of all, this child could kill Arthur. Morgana saw him not just as a child, nor did she see him only as a druid. Morgana saw her own reflection in Mordred, a child orphaned at a young age, ostracized because of his magic, raised in fear and hatred, just like Morgana. But the big difference was that Mordred was still malleable. Morgana could turn him into someone like herself, a child whose magic was forbidden, whose fate was sealed. But in the right hands, he could become a weapon. Morgana also realized how terrified Merlin had been when he first saw Mordred. Merlin was protecting Arthur. Merlin was protecting the future of Camelot. And if Merlin was afraid of Mordred, it meant that Mordred could destroy that future. That thought quietly took root in Morgana's mind. Days, months passed. Morgana watched Mordred. She spoke to the druids who secretly taught him magic. He whispered to her that she could choose her own destiny. At first, Mordred kept Morgana at a distance, but over time, her words began to gnaw at him. Morgana told him that Arthur would never accept people like him. She reminded him that there was no place for wizards in Camelot, and most importantly, that Arthur would one day kill him. That was the first hatred that Mordred ever felt. Morgana did not raise Mordred as a soldier, nor did she train him as a warrior. She only gave him an idea, and that idea in time became a weapon. But fate can't always be controlled, can it? Morgana thought she could use Mordred like a toy. He thought she was a pawn. But there was one thing she forgot. The hatred was uncontrollable. Morgana fostered hatred in Mordred, but it wasn't just against Arthur. Over time, Mordred came to hate Morgana too, because Morgana had taught him only to hate, not love, not loyalty, just hate. And remember, my young friend, when you turn someone into a weapon, one day that weapon can turn on you. Morgana would realize this much, much too late. Many years had passed since Arthur had ascended the throne of Camelot. His reign had grown strong. He had won the love of his people and begun to carry on his father's legacy. But in Morgana's eyes, Arthur was still an invader. And even if he wanted to be a just king, His banning of magic was unforgivable in her eyes. To Morgana, Arthur was just a follower of Uther, and if she wanted Camelot to be a home for wizards, Arthur had to fall. At first she started with small steps. A kingdom was more easily overthrown from within than by a blow from without. Morgana knew this. A kingdom could fall not with sword and shield, but with whispers and intrigue. She began to observe those within the court who were loyal to Arthur. Who was ready to give their life for him? Who would hesitate? Who was inclined to betray him? He waited to understand everyone's weaknesses. Patiently, in silence, he started with the weakest first. He spoke to the old lords who were dissatisfied with Arthur's reign, who longed for Uther's strict rule. He whispered to them that Arthur's kingdom was weakening, that standing up to the wizards would bring the fall of Camelot. He planted seeds of doubt in people's minds. Then he turned to the guards of Camelot. There were restless ones among them too. Some wanted more power. Others saw Arthur's peaceful policies as weakness. Morgana fed their ambition, but her most important move was to target one of Arthur's most trusted men, Sir Agravain. Agravain was a powerful and respected noble who had served Camelot since Uther's time. But there was a nagging feeling that Arthur had never made him one of his closest advisors. Morgana realized this and did her best to rekindle this small spark. She told Agravain that Arthur's rule was leading Camelot to disaster. She made him believe that Arthur saw him as a pawn to be sacrificed one day, and in the end, Agravain was ready to betray him. With his help, Morgana organized the first real rebellion inside Camelot. She recruited Arthur's disaffected guards, restless nobles, and some of the disgruntled commoners. A small but influential group was ready to move against Arthur inside the palace. Their plan was simple. When Arthur went out on a hunting party, there would be a sudden uproar at court, loyal guards would be killed, and Arthur would return to find that Camelot was no longer his. But there was one thing Morgana forgot. Arthur was not alone. Merlin sensed something was wrong that night. There was an unusual silence in the palace during Arthur's absence. Whispers grew louder. Shadows deepened. Trusting his instincts, Merlin, along with a few knights loyal to Arthur, witnessed the outbreak of the rebellion. The rebellion began at midnight. As Agravain and Morgana's men drew their weapons, Merlin had already sent word to Arthur. But there was no time to wait for Arthur's return. The palace was a bloodbath, loyalties were tested, and the face of treachery was revealed. When Arthur returned at dawn, Camelot was still in his hands, but he knew that everything had changed. And Morgana, that night his plan had failed, but he had made his first great move. This was only the beginning. One attack would not be enough for Camelot to fall, but Morgana now knew what she had done wrong. Her next move would be stronger, more decisive, more devastating. She would make Arthur lose one of his most trusted men and continue to rot Camelot from within. The scales of fate were still in the balance, but Morgana would go to any length to tip the scales in her favor. As time went on, Morgana grew more and more consumed by hatred and a thirst for revenge. Plotting intrigues within Camelot, shaking Arthur's trust and trying to tear the kingdom down from the inside had never been enough. Arthur always managed to stay one step ahead, but Morgana's eyes were now open to greater power, to darker knowledge. No matter how ambitious she was, she knew she couldn't defeat Arthur on her own strength. She needed more, a stronger mentor, deeper knowledge. And fate would bring her face to face with just the person she needed, Morgause. Morgause was someone Morgana didn't know, but who had been watching her for years. They shared the same blood. Morgause was Morgana's half-sister, but their bond went beyond blood. Morgause was a follower of the old religion, a master sorceress with deep knowledge of magic. She had waged war against the ban on magic in Camelot and made it her mission to bring down Arthur's reign. Morgause saw the anger inside Morgana. recognized her potential, and realized she could show her the way. To Morgause, Morgana was not just an ambitious noblewoman. She was one of the greatest weapons that could bring down Camelot. When Morgana first met her, she felt an instinctive connection. Morgause gave her a sense of trust, but also showed her what true power was. With her, Morgana learned that magic wasn't just a hidden talent. It was a weapon. At first, Morgana was hesitant. She'd lived for years hiding her powers, raised with the knowledge that magic was punishable by death in Camelot. But under Morgause's guidance, she began to put aside her fears. For the first time, she was in a place where she didn't need to hide her magic. Morgause didn't just teach her the basics of magic, she taught her the most powerful forms: mind control, curses, illusion spells. Morgana's power was far greater than she'd ever imagined. But most importantly, Morgause taught her patience. Morgana's greatest weakness was her impatience. She wanted to overthrow Arthur immediately, destroy Camelot as soon as possible, but Morgause told her that revenge had to be built over time. Power wasn't just gained through brute force, it was won through strategic plays. And Morgana etched that lesson into her mind. Every day spent with Morgause made her more determined, more ruthless, and stronger. She was no longer alone in her fight against Arthur. She had gained not just an ally, but a teacher and a companion. And most importantly, Morgause gave her the greatest gift of all, a plan to bring Arthur down. This was no longer a personal battle. It was a war of the old religion, magic, and suppressed powers against Camelot. Under Morgause's guidance, Morgana would no longer be just an enemy. She would become Camelot's greatest nightmare. Ah, my child, power doesn't lie in the sharpness of the sword, but in the depth of the mind. Morgana knew this better than anyone. Swords clash, warriors fall, but if the mind is captured, the kingdom will kneel. She wasn't alone anymore. Under Morgause's guidance, she had honed her magic to its fullest potential and gained strong allies both inside and outside Camelot. But there was still one problem: Arthur. Arthur was resisting Morgana's plots, sensing her secret moves and maintaining his grip on the throne. That's why Morgana needed to try something different. She couldn't defeat him with a sword or in battle, but his mind? That was more fragile than any battlefield. So Morgana set one of her most devious plans into motion, poisoning Arthur's mind. Instead of fighting him head-on, Morgana targeted Arthur's greatest strength, his sense of justice and his belief in righteousness. Morgause had taught her that to guide his enemies, she needed to use not swords, but lies and prophecies. Using her magic, Morgana began to infiltrate Arthur's dreams. When night fell and Camelot was wrapped in silence, Morgana would call upon her powers and whisper into Arthur's mind. At first they were just vague nightmares: burned fields, broken walls, a king betrayed. Arthur would wake up in the morning feeling unrested and uneasy, but the dreams soon worsened. Morgana began to shape Arthur's greatest fears. One night, Arthur dreamed that Lancelot had betrayed him. Guinevere was in another man's arms and Camelot was burning. Another night, he dreamed that Gawain had died on the battlefield and the Round Table had fallen apart. Each dream planted more seeds of doubt in Arthur's heart. Morgana's magic was wearing him down, eating away at him. He couldn't even find peace in his sleep anymore. Slowly, Morgana was breaking Arthur's will. But Morgana didn't stop with just dreams. Prophecies were one of the most powerful forces shaping the destiny of the people of Camelot. The people believed in ancient seers and prophecies written in magic. Morgana decided to use this to her advantage. With magic, she guided false prophets to spread disaster prophecies throughout Camelot. A betrayal will come from among Camelot's closest friends. The Round Table will shatter. Brother will draw a sword against brother. Arthur's throne will be shaken by one of his own blood. These prophecies slowly began to spread as whispers among the people. Arthur's advisors brought these rumors to him, and fear began to take root in the king's mind. Who was this traitor? Was it Lancelot, Gawain, maybe even his own sister Morgana? Arthur started to look at those around him with suspicion. Earning his trust wasn't as easy as it used to be. Even the knights of the Round Table began to look like potential traitors in his eyes. Morgana's magic was isolating Arthur, but that wasn't enough for Morgana. She didn't just want Arthur to feel suspicious. She wanted him to make a mistake, because she knew that a king's downfall comes from his own errors. And that mistake would come soon. Ah, my child, in a world where the strong are considered right, everyone who thinks they're right will fight for power. Morgana knew she had a place in Camelot's destiny, but that place shouldn't be in the shadows, behind others. She was meant to be a ruler. She couldn't accept Arthur as the legitimate king of Camelot. Uther Pendragon was Morgana's father. She wasn't just a lady, she was of royal blood, the true heir to the throne. But fate had given her a shadow, not a crown. Morgana watched Arthur rise over the years, while she always stayed in the background. The throne, a right she should have inherited, was sealed by Arthur's sword. And for Morgana, that was nothing but an injustice. When she was young, Morgana's true birth was kept a secret. It was a shameful secret of Uther Pendragon. The king had never formed a bond with her. He'd raised her only as a lady. But over time, Morgana began to uncover the truth. First through whispers, then with guidance from Nimue and Morgause. They told her she had more of a right to the throne than Arthur, that Uther had stolen her birthright. The anger inside her began to grow that day. She wasn't just a noblewoman. She was the true heir to the throne. But Morgana didn't just want to prove she was the heir. She needed to show that she could be a better ruler than Arthur. Arthur was a warrior. He was just, but often acted on his emotions. He ruled his kingdom with his sword, and Morgana believed this would weaken Camelot. She, however, could rule a kingdom with her intelligence, magic, and cunning. Camelot was a kingdom that forbade magic, but Morgana knew that without the power of the old gods, magic, and sorcery, Camelot would never become a true empire. She carried the wisdom of the ancient gods. The future of Camelot would be shaped by the acceptance of magic again. To achieve this, Arthur had to be overthrown. Morgana wasn't playing simple games anymore. Every plan she made was designed to place her on Camelot's throne. First, she started to gain the support of the people. She whispered Arthur's mistakes to the nobles in the court, spreading rumors about his wrong decisions among the people. A population that questioned Arthur's justice would be open to a new ruler. But her most important plan was to turn Arthur's most trusted allies against him. She had to create cracks in the Round Table. Even his most loyal knights had to begin to doubt him. She needed to make Arthur stand alone. For Morgana, Camelot was her birthright. To claim it, all she had to do was slowly push Arthur toward his downfall. And now the queen in the shadows was closer than ever to taking her throne. Sometimes, my child, as a story nears its end, the line between heroes and traitors becomes clearer. No shadow lasts forever, and in the end, light always shines through the darkness. The story of Morgana and Arthur was shaped by that battle between darkness and light, betrayal and loyalty. Morgana's plans had started to take deep root within Camelot. With her magic, rumors, and prophecies, she had shaken Arthur's rule, but eventually, nothing could stay hidden. The scent of her betrayal began to spread through the halls of Camelot. Every move she made, every dark plan, eventually caught her in her own web. Arthur, after years of doubt, decided to follow the trail. Morgana's every move was like missing pieces of a puzzle, and in the end, those pieces fell into place. Morgana's betrayal was fully revealed. This was the greatest blow a sibling could deliver, the deepest wound. Arthur, responsible for Camelot's throne, safety, and sacred values, was forced to see his once most trusted blood his sister as an enemy. The confrontation between Arthur and Morgana was inevitable. When Morgana looked at him, her former brother, her old ruler, what did she see? Once they grew up together, once they formed a bond like a family, but now Arthur, the one who sat on the throne and offered her a dazzling crown, had also taken every right from her. A world that belittled Arthur, one that didn't accept his true potential. For Morgana, that power was now a deep resentment. But this resentment wasn't something that could be summed up in words alone. Arthur was slowly suffocating under the weight of her magic. Morgana hoped to strike the final blow by revealing her magic in the midst of battle. They took to the battlefield, and these two souls, once siblings, now drew their swords against each other. On one side, Arthur's sword, on the other, Morgana's magic. One's power was physical, while the other's was mental and mystical. Yet, the fire within both of them burned equally. The first strikes tested both of them. Morgana tried to send Arthur a blast of her century-old magic, but Arthur, like a knight, raised his sword to deflect the attack. He was pushing back Morgana's magic with his sword. And in that moment, my child, everything changed. The moment when both warriors kept fighting, filled with infinite anger and resentment, would go down in history as one of the greatest conflicts. Morgana thought of using her mind's magic to strike Arthur, but time was working against her. Arthur, now a master of this dark battle, was forcing Morgana into a corner with each strike. In the end, centuries of magic and hatred fell before Arthur's sword. Morgana, who had just felt the power within her body, now felt weak. She was broken. The magic flowing through her mind was cut off, its power fading as her fury sent her crashing to the ground. Arthur's sword delivered her end. Arthur, with a look filled with both pain and anger in his eyes, delivered the final blow to Morgana. But that blow wasn't aimed at his sister. As Camelot's ruler, even though his heart ached, he had to fulfill the duty of justice. Morgana was defeated but not killed. She was exiled from the gates of Camelot, as Arthur cast his sister, the one who once had hope for the throne within her, out of this land. His heart carried another burden, but Camelot's future was saved. Morgana, however, couldn't face her defeat. For her, it wasn't over. It was time to make a new plan for revenge and retreat into the shadows. After all, anger hidden in shadows only grows stronger with time. And so, my child, history is written. The story of two siblings shaped by disappointment, betrayal, and mutual enmity. Arthur sat securely on the throne again, protecting Camelot from danger. But Morgana's story continued to grow in the shadows, deeper in darkness. Perhaps her story hadn't even started yet. And maybe, one day, she would return.